My name is Father Thomas, and for 40 years now, the venerable walls of St. Jude Thaddeus have been my home, its altar, my anchor, its congregation, my family. 40 years is a long stretch, long enough to see seasons turn into decades, saplings grow into shade trees, and vibrant young faces slowly acquire the etched wisdom of age. St. Jude's, our patron saint of lost causes, has always been a quiet sort of parish, a place of solace rather than clamor, of gentle rhythms rather than fervent zeal. I loved it for that, for the predictable comfort of its routines, the hushed reverence of morning mass, the confidential intimacy of the confessional, the solitary peace of the rectory garden at dusk. There was a quiet beauty to this existence, a gentle unfolding of God's grace in the small, unassuming moments. Yet, if I am truly honest with myself, as a priest must always strive to be, I would admit that this peace had begun to acquire a certain stillness. Not the vibrant stillness of deep meditation, but perhaps the quiet of something winding down. Our congregation, once a bustling hive of families, had thinned over the years, leaving behind a loyal but aging core. The hymns, though sung with heartfelt devotion, no longer resonated with the booming collective force of youth. The peeling paint on the rectory walls, the faint dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight, slicing through the stained glass windows, even the faint scent of old hymnals and beeswax, all whispered of a fading glory, a gentle descent into a kind of benevolent obscurity. We were a good parish, yes, a steadfast one, but perhaps a little too comfortable in our predictable quietude, a little too accustomed to the gentle ebb of life rather than its vibrant flow. I prayed, of course, for renewal, for a spark to rekindle the flame, but these prayers often felt like murmurs carried on a still breeze, echoing without immediate response. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, the stillness broke. The air, usually thick with the scent of old wood and the lingering incense from Sunday, seemed to shift, to acquire an unexpected edge. I was in the sacristy, preparing for my daily private mass, the familiar weight of the chasuble settling comfortably on my shoulders, when I heard it, a soft scuffling, barely a sound, from the nave. It was too early for parishioners, too late for the cleaning crew. My curiosity, a quiet companion rarely roused, stirred within me. I emerged, my prayer book still open in my hand, and there he was, a boy, no older than 10, perhaps 8, though his small frame made it difficult to tell for certain. He was seated in the very last pew, nestled deep into the dark oak, almost swallowed by its shadows. What struck me first, before his age or his smallness, was the grime. He was covered in it, from the tips of his unruly dark hair to the scuffed toes of his broken shoes. A layer so thick, so pervasive, that it seemed less like dirt accumulated and more like a second skin, a part of his very being. It clung to his small face, streaked his cheeks, caked beneath his fingernails, rendering him almost indistinguishable from the shadowed corners of the old church. He did not stir when I entered. He did not flinch, or hide, or even look away. His gaze, even from the distance of the altar, was fixed, unwavering, not on me, not on the crucifix, but somewhere indistinct, past the altar rail, perhaps beyond the stained glass depiction of St. Jude himself. It was a gaze of intense observation, utterly devoid of childish curiosity or fear, holding instead an unnerving intensity that made the hairs on my arms prickle. He was simply watching. He didn't make the sign of the cross, nor did he kneel. He did not seem to pray. He just sat, a small, dirty, silent sentinel, observing. His presence was like a stone dropped into a perfectly still pond. The ripples, though subtle, spread through the hallowed quiet of my church, disrupting the long-established peace I had come to take for granted. This was not the restless energy of a bored child dragged to Mass by his parents. This was something entirely different, an unsettling disruption, a question mark etched into the sacred space. I completed my Mass that morning, my thoughts straying, my prayers perhaps a little less focused than usual. The boy remained in the pew, silent and still, until the last whisper of my benediction faded into the rafters. Then, with the same quiet efficiency with which he had arrived, he rose and slipped out through the heavy oak doors, leaving behind only the faintest scent of damp earth and an indelible impression on my soul. I confess, I expected him to be a one-time apparition, a lost lamb who would find his way home after a single visit, but the next day, a Wednesday, he was there again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each morning, just after the first bell for morning prayers, he would materialize, a small, dirty ghost, in the house of God. He always chose the same pew, the last one on the gospel side, as if it were his designated post. He never spoke, he never prayed, he never approached the altar for communion, or even to light a candle. He simply watched, his dark eyes absorbing everything, yet revealing nothing. His presence began to feel like a steady, unspoken challenge. My comfortable routine, once a source of solace, now felt slightly exposed. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards, every shaft of dust-filled light, every flicker of the altar candles seemed amplified by his silent vigil. He was an anomaly, a jagged shard of reality in the smooth, well-worn fabric of my spiritual life. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why St. Jude's? These questions looped endlessly in my mind as I went about my duties, serving the few faithful, preparing homilies that now felt, to my own ear, a little too safe, a little too comfortable. I tried, in those early days, to engage him. After Mass, when the last parishioner had departed and only the dust motes danced in the fading light, I would approach him. "Hello, son," I'd begin, my voice as gentle as I could make it, trying to bridge the vast chasm of his silence. "Are you lost? Are you hungry? We have food here, a warm place to rest." I would offer a hand, a smile, a promise of shelter. But he would only meet my gaze, his eyes, dark and fathomless, holding an unnerving intensity that seemed far too old for his young face. He wasn't defiant or afraid or even shy. He was simply inaccessible, as if he wasn't a boy at all, but a vessel, an empty chalice waiting to be filled, or perhaps a messenger waiting for the appointed time to deliver a secret he could not yet articulate. His silence was not empty. It was a weight in the nave, a profound and heavy question I, a priest of 40 years, felt utterly incapable of answering. It hung in the air, a spiritual query that permeated the very stone and wood of St. Jude's. The familiar peace of my church was gone, replaced by an acute awareness of this small, silent observer, whose presence, though physically unobtrusive, was shaking the foundations of my quiet, comfortable faith. He was a mystery, a whisper of something new and unsettling on the horizon, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that his arrival was no mere coincidence. It was a sign. But of what, I could not yet say. Only that the long, quiet sleep of St. Jude's had been broken. The long, quiet sleep of St. Jude's had indeed been broken, and with its rupture came not a clamor, as one might expect from something being jarred awake, but an even deeper, more profound silence. It was the kind of silence that hums, that prickles the skin, that makes one aware of the very beat of one's own heart in the absence of other sounds. The boy's presence, previously a mere disruption, had quickly transmuted into something more substantial, more pervasive, a spiritual weight pressing down on the familiar rhythms of my days. He continued his daily vigil, a small, dark silhouette against the stained-glass depiction of St. Jude Thaddeus in the last pew. His eyes, I swear, absorbing every flicker of candle flame, every rustle of a missal, every whispered prayer. He arrived with the first sliver of dawn that peeked through the east-facing windows long before Mrs. Henderson unlocked the main doors, somehow finding entry through a side door that had a faulty latch only I knew about. He would sit, still as stone, until the shadows stretched long and the evening bell tolled for the Angelus, then melt away as silently as he had come. He never seemed to eat the small bags of food left for him during his watch, only taking them when he departed, leaving behind a subtle, lingering question mark in the sanctity of the nave. Soon enough, the whispers began. Not malicious, certainly not in St. Jude's, but tinged with the kind of unease that settles when the familiar is invaded by the unknown. It was after Sunday Mass, during the customary mingling outside on the cracked flagstones, that the boy became less of a private concern for me and more of a communal mystery. The scent of coffee and stale communion wafers still hung faintly in the autumn air, mingling with the crisp smell of fallen leaves, as small clusters of parishioners gathered, their voices hushed, their glances darting towards the church's entrance, as if expecting the boy to materialize and eavesdrop. "Father Thomas," Mrs. Gable began, her voice a low thrum of worry, pulling me gently by the sleeve of my alb. Her spectacles, perched precariously on the tip of her nose, seemed to magnify the concern in her eyes. Mrs. Gable, bless her meticulous heart, was the self-appointed guardian of St. Jude's material well-being. She handled the collection plate counting, organized the bake sales, and knew the exact square footage of every carpet stain. Her faith was sturdy, like an oak, but her worldview was grounded firmly in the practicalities of this earth. This invader," she whispered, her brow furrowed, the word escaping her lips with a barely perceptible hiss. She glanced around, as if the very walls might listen. "He's still here, every day. What if he's casing the place, Father? What if he's looking for something to take?" Her concern was not entirely unfounded, I suppose. Our little church, though humble, held certain precious artifacts, the silver chalice, the antique crucifix, the donation box, but I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that this boy was not after silver or gold. His gaze held no greed, only an unnerving depth. Yet I could not dismiss Mrs. Gable's fears lightly. Her loyalty to St. Jude's was absolute, and her anxieties, however misplaced, came from a place of love and a desire to protect. "He seems harmless, Mrs. Gable," I replied, attempting to soothe her, though, even to my own ears, my voice lacked its usual conviction. "Perhaps he's simply lost, seeking warmth or solace." She pursed her lips, a gesture that conveyed her profound skepticism. "Solace, Father? He doesn't pray. He doesn't make the sign of the cross. He just sits there, watching, like a hawk." She shivered slightly, though the day was mild. "It's unsettling. Our quiet peace, it's gone." And there it was, the articulation of my own unspoken apprehension. The familiar peace, which I had once mistaken for spiritual tranquility, had perhaps been merely a quietude born of inertia. Now it was indeed gone, replaced by a subtle, constant thrum of anticipation, a question mark hanging in the air that permeated even Mrs. Gable's practical concerns. But not all shared Mrs. Gable's apprehension. Young Maria Sanchez, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, approached us then, her eyes soft with an entirely different kind of worry. Maria, a recent immigrant from El Salvador, had found a spiritual home in St. Jude's, and her faith was as fresh and vibrant as the morning dew. She cleaned the altar linens with an almost sacred reverence, and always brought a bouquet of wildflowers from her small garden to adorn the Blessed Mother's statue. "Father Thomas, Mrs. Gable," she began, her English still carrying the gentle lilt of her native tongue, "we must not think ill of him. He is a child of God, no less than any of us. Perhaps he is hungry. Perhaps he is cold. We must show him Christian charity, yes?" Her gaze was earnest, direct, holding the kind of pure, unblemished compassion that I, with all my years, sometimes struggled to maintain. Every afternoon, as the boy slipped into his pew, Maria would leave a small, carefully wrapped bundle on the very edge of the pew arm nearest him. Sometimes it was a fresh-baked empanada, still warm and fragrant. Other times, a piece of fruit, or a small sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She never tried to speak to him, merely placed the offering, offered a small, shy smile, and then retreated to her own work, polishing the brass candle holders or dusting the communion rail. The boy never acknowledged her, not with a nod, not with a glance, not even a flicker of recognition. Yet, when he left for the day, the bundle was always gone. It was a silent exchange, a testament to the quiet, persistent grace of Maria's heart, and the equally persistent impenetrable mystery of the boys. I, too, made my attempts. I considered it my duty, my spiritual obligation, to reach out to this lost lamb, for I was utterly convinced he was lost, if not geographically, then certainly spiritually. Many a time after the last rays of sun had begun their slow descent, painting the dusty motes in the air with hues of gold and rose, I would approach his pew. The old wood groaned softly beneath my weight as I knelt beside him, trying to meet his eye, to offer the simplest of human connections. "My dear boy," I would begin, my voice soft, warm, as gentle as I could make it. "Are you hungry? I have a warm meal waiting in the rectory. There's a good stew on the stove and fresh bread. You are welcome to share it. We have a spare room, too, if you need a place to rest your head for the night. It's warm and safe." I would offer him the most basic comforts, the most fundamental expressions of human kindness, hoping that some chink in his armor would appear. But he would only ever turn his head slowly, his eyes, those unnervingly clear, intense eyes, locking onto mine. There was no fear in them, no shyness, no overt curiosity. Instead, there was something akin to ancient understanding, a wisdom that seemed to stretch beyond his tender years, perhaps even beyond the bounds of ordinary human experience. He looked at me, not as a child looks at an adult, but as a seer might look upon a seeking soul, assessing, absorbing, but revealing nothing. He saw me, I felt, in a way few others ever had, peering past the cassock and the title into the very essence of Father Thomas, the man. He never spoke, not a word, not a grunt, not a sigh, not a whisper. His silence was absolute, unyielding, yet it was not empty. It was a loaded silence, pregnant with unspoken meaning, a reservoir of information I could not access. It was as if he was not a boy, not truly, but merely a temporary vessel for a message he himself could not yet deliver, or perhaps for a message I was not yet ready to receive. And so I would eventually retreat, feeling clumsy and inadequate, my words hanging uselessly in the vast space between us. His silence was not just a weight in the nave, it became a weight in my own soul, a profound and heavy question that echoed in the quietest chambers of my heart. It permeated my prayers, subtly altering their timbre, shifting my focus from the comfortable litany of petitions to an insistent, silent plea for understanding. It crept into my sermons, rendering my words, which once flowed with such ease, suddenly hesitant, for what authority could I claim when faced with such an unyielding spiritual enigma? I, a priest of 40 years, who had comforted the dying, baptized the newborn, absolved the repentant, now felt utterly incapable of understanding this one small, silent child. My comfortable faith, honed by decades of routine and predictable miracles of grace, felt shaken. Had I grown complacent? Had the gentle rhythms of St. Jude's lulled me into a spiritual slumber, much like the faded paint on the rectory walls? This boy, this quiet, unassuming invader, was forcing me to confront not only his mystery, but my own limitations. His presence, though physically unobtrusive, was shaking the very foundations of my quiet, comfortable faith. He was a living mystery, a whisper of something new and unsettling on the horizon, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that his arrival was no mere coincidence. It was a sign, not just for St. Jude's, but perhaps, I dared to hope, for my own soul. But of what? I could not yet say. Only that the long, quiet sleep of St. Jude's had been broken, and the uncomfortable awakening had only just begun. The silence of the boy was not an absence of sound, but a profound presence, an invitation to a different kind of listening, a listening with the heart, for a truth that words could not yet carry. The weeks that followed were an exercise in a unique kind of spiritual waiting, a vigil unlike any I had kept before. The boy, our silent invader, had indeed become a permanent fixture in the dim, quiet corners of St. Jude's. He moved with the subtle grace of a shadow, never disturbing a prayer book, never leaving so much as a smudge on the polished pews. Yet his presence was a constant, unsettling hum beneath the surface of my comfortable routines. He was there for morning mass, his eyes fixed on the altar with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the sacred space. He was there during my quiet hours of reflection, a small, still figure in the last pew, a question mark etched into the silence. And he was there when the last parishioner had departed, vanishing as mysteriously as he appeared, only to resurface the next day. I had tried, of course, to bridge the chasm of his silence. Daily, I would approach his pew, my voice softened by years of comforting the sorrowful and guiding the lost. "Good morning, son," I'd begin. "Is there anything you need? A warm meal? A place to rest? My rectory has an extra room, you know." He would simply lift his head, his gaze unwavering, those remarkably clear eyes, framed by streaks of grime, holding a depth I could not fathom. He never flinched, never spoke, never offered a single gesture of acknowledgement beyond that unnerving stare. It was as if he were a vessel, perfectly empty, waiting to be filled, or perhaps already filled with a truth he was forbidden to speak, a message held captive by something profoundly significant. His silence was not a void, I realized, but a profound presence, a different kind of listening indeed, as I had intuited, one that demanded I listen with my heart for a truth that words could not yet carry. The whispers among the parishioners had not ceased. If anything, they had softened, evolving from suspicion to a kind of resigned, puzzled acceptance. Mrs. Gable still fretted, though now her worry was tinged with a reluctant affection for the boy she secretly left fresh-baked cookies for. Young Maria Sanchez continued to leave her offerings of sandwiches and fruit, which he always accepted with a silent nod to the empty air, never to her. The church had absorbed him, in its own slow, measured way. He was no longer the invader to most, but simply the boy, a quiet mystery that had settled into the soul of St. Jude's, stirring it awake from its long, languid sleep. As the weeks bled into a full month, the early autumn leaves began to turn, painting the world outside St. Jude's in hues of gold and rust, a vibrant, transient beauty that seemed to mock the church's quiet, unchanging interior. My own internal landscape, however, was shifting. The boy's persistence, his unwavering commitment to his silent vigil, had begun to erode the comfortable foundations of my faith, not in God, no, never in God, but in my understanding of his workings. I had come to see divine intervention in grand gestures, in the suffering that led to profound repentance, in the desperate prayer answered with miraculous healing. But this boy, this small, silent, dirty sentinel, was a different kind of miracle, a slow, unfolding revelation that demanded patience and a radical openness to the unexpected. He was teaching me, I realized, that sometimes the divine whispers rather than shouts, and that the most profound truths often arrive not with fanfare, but with the quiet dignity of a sunrise. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a day much like any other, wrapped in the gentle melancholia of late September. The sun, slanting through the high-arched windows of St. Jude's, cast long, dusty beams across the nave, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the sacred air. The church was empty, save for myself and the boy, who occupied his usual post in the last pew, a small, dark silhouette against the golden light. I was preparing for our weekly adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, a cherished tradition in our parish, though often attended by only a handful of the most devout. The silence of the church, usually a balm, felt charged that afternoon, a vessel stretched taut, ready to reverberate with something yet unspoken. I was in the sacristy, the small, quiet room adjacent to the altar, carefully donning my vestments, the crisp linen of the alb, the intricate embroidery of the stole, the weighty folds of the gold chasuble, each piece a tangible link to centuries of tradition, a physical preparation for the spiritual encounter to come. My mind was already turning to the gospel reading for the day, to the homily I would offer, a gentle reflection on perseverance and the quiet strength of faith. The faint scent of old incense and beeswax hung in the air, a comforting perfume of sanctity. As I adjusted the chasuble over my shoulders, the rich fabric settling with a soft rustle, A subtle shift in the air caught my attention. It wasn't a sound, precisely, but a feeling, a disturbance in the profound stillness that permeated St. Jude's. I paused, my hands still on the fabric, and turned towards the archway leading into the sanctuary. There he was. For the first time since his arrival, the boy had left his post in the last pew. He was standing at the foot of the altar, a tiny, almost ethereal figure silhouetted against the vibrant stained-glass window depicting St. Jude Thaddeus himself. His normally downcast head was raised, his gaze fixed not on me, but on something just beyond my line of sight. My heart, which had been beating with its usual placid rhythm, gave a sudden, surprised lurch. This was new. This was different. He was no longer a distant observer, but an active presence, drawn by some unseen force towards the very heart of our worship. My initial reaction was a mixture of concern and a fragile, nascent hope. Was he finally ready to speak, to ask for help, to tell me his name, his story? I remained still, unwilling to startle him, allowing him this unprecedented journey into the sacred space. He stood there for a long moment, utterly motionless, as if gathering the courage for an act of immense significance. Then, slowly, deliberately, he began to walk towards me. His footsteps, if they made any sound at all, were absorbed by the ancient stone floor. He approached the altar rail, then stepped over it with a quiet determination that belied his small stature. He came right up to me, stopping just a foot away, his head tilted back as he looked up. His eyes, those eyes, they were no longer shadowed by the dimness of the last pew, no longer veiled by what I had assumed was a mixture of fear and defiance. In the soft light of the sanctuary, they were remarkably clear, a startling shade of hazel, piercingly focused. There was no fear in them now, no childish timidity, but an unnerving intensity, an almost ancient knowing. They held me captive, drawing me into their depths, conveying a certainty that left no room for doubt or question. He then did something that sent a jolt, both physical and spiritual, through my entire being. He reached out a small, trembling hand, dirt-caked and smudged, and gently, ever so gently, tugged on the heavy gold fabric of my chasuble. It was a slight gesture, almost imperceptible, yet it resonated through me like the striking of a bell. After weeks of silent observation, of averted gazes and unspoken needs, this was his first direct contact, his first unambiguous communication. I looked down at him, my breath caught in my throat, a profound sense of anticipation swirling within me. My mind raced, trying to decipher the meaning of this unprecedented act. Was he cold? Hungry? Lost in a new way? I knelt slowly, bringing myself to his eye level, my heart pounding a rhythm against my ribs that was far too fast for a man of my age. "Yes, son," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, trying to keep it steady. "What is it you need? Tell me." He looked at me, his gaze unflinching, those clear eyes searching mine as if seeking a profound understanding. The air in the sanctuary seemed to thicken, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams appearing to hang suspended, waiting. I waited, utterly still, my every fiber attuned to him, for the sound of his voice, a sound I had almost begun to believe I would never hear. Then he spoke. It was a single word, raspy and fragile, as if his vocal cords were unaccustomed to the very act of speech, yet utterly clear, cutting through the heavy silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Broken. The word hung in the air, echoing not just in the vastness of the sanctuary, but deep within the chambers of my own heart. Broken. It was a word that carried weight, a word that resonated with the forgotten corners of St. Jude's, with the peeling paint, the aging congregation, the quiet, fading spirit I had acknowledged in my very first reflections. It was a word that, for a fleeting moment, made a chilling kind of sense, describing so much that I saw around me. But then, before I could fully process the unexpected sound of his voice, or the profound implication of his single utterance, his small, trembling finger, still smudged with the grime of the streets, lifted slowly. His hand was steady now, pointing. He pointed past me, towards the alcove to the left of the main altar. My gaze instinctively followed the line of his finger, traveling across the familiar golden glow of the tabernacle, past the flickering vigil lights, to where the grand, antique statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus stood. The statue, of course, it was a magnificent piece, carved from dark, polished wood, depicting Jesus with his hand raised in blessing, his other hand gesturing towards his chest, where the Sacred Heart, aflame with divine love, was typically rendered. I had seen it countless times, hundreds, thousands of times over my 40 years at St. Jude's. It was a beloved, if somewhat overlooked, fixture, a silent sentinel of faith that I had grown so accustomed to, it had become almost invisible. My eyes landed on it, searching, trying to understand why this child, who had finally broken his silence, would point to a perfectly ordinary, if old, statue. I scanned its familiar contours, its serene expression, its outstretched hand. And then, my gaze settled on the very place the boy's finger was directing me, the chest of the carving, where the Sacred Heart should have been prominently displayed. And there it was, what I saw, what I had overlooked for decades, what my eyes had passed over time and again without truly seeing, was now starkly, undeniably evident. There was a hollow space in the chest of the carving. Not a crack, not a blemish, not a subtle imperfection in the wood, but a distinct, empty cavity, a precisely carved void. It was a space clearly designed to hold a separate central piece, the heart itself. The boy's word, broken, echoed once more in my mind, no longer an abstract lament, but a precise, terrifyingly accurate description. The statue was, quite literally, broken. It was incomplete. The very heart of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the central symbol of divine love and compassion, was missing. A wave of profound shame washed over me, a physical nausea rising in my gut. How could I have been so blind? So utterly, astonishingly unobservant? For 40 years, I had walked past this statue every day, offered Mass before it, knelt in prayer within its silent gaze, and never once truly seen this gaping absence. My comfortable routine, my quiet peace, had rendered me oblivious to this stark, glaring incompleteness in the very heart of our sanctuary. The boy simply stood there, his arms slowly lowering, his gaze still fixed on my face, those clear, knowing eyes silently affirming his message. He had spoken, he had pointed, and he had revealed a truth that had been hidden in plain sight, not by design, but by our collective, comfortable blindness. He had delivered his message, a single, potent word, and like a messenger who has completed his sacred duty, he then turned and, with the same silent grace with which he had approached, returned to his accustomed place in the last pew, leaving me utterly alone at the altar, kneeling amidst the echoes of his raspy word and the shocking revelation of a broken heart. The long, quiet sleep of St. Jude's had not merely been broken, it had been shattered, and the uncomfortable awakening, I now understood with a chilling certainty, had only just begun. The boy, this silent, mysterious messenger, was no longer just an unsettling presence. He was an instrument, a vessel of divine providence, sent to reveal not just a physical absence, but perhaps a deeper, spiritual brokenness in our midst, one that I, the shepherd, had utterly failed to perceive. My comfortable faith, once a source of gentle solace, was now being tested, stretched, and redefined by the profound simplicity of a child's single, earth-shattering word. The single, raspy word, broken, echoed not just in the hushed expanse of St. Jude's sanctuary, but deep within the quiet chambers of my own soul. It lingered in the air, a physical presence, as the boy, this young silent oracle, retreated to his pew, leaving me kneeling before the altar. The comfortable illusion of peace that had draped St. Jude's for so long had indeed been shattered, and I, Father Thomas, who had prided myself on my pastoral attentiveness, now felt the chilling certainty of my own blindness. His small, dirt-caked finger had pointed to the statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and in that instant, decades of familiarity had melted away, revealing a truth I had overlooked, the hollow space in its chest. a gaping wound where a central piece, the very heart of the carving, should have been. It wasn't merely a chipped piece, or a cosmetic flaw I had grown accustomed to, it was an undeniable absence, a void, and the boy, in his profound, unsettling wisdom, had seen it, understood it, and articulated it with a clarity that shamed my own spiritual complacency. My comfortable faith, once a gentle balm, now felt like a well-worn garment, threadbare and inadequate against the sharp, sudden gust of divine mystery. How could I, a priest of 40 years, have missed such a glaring imperfection in the very heart of our church's most venerated image? Was it simply negligence or something deeper? A reflection, perhaps, of a larger spiritual emptiness I had allowed to fester, disguised by the rituals and routines of a quiet parish. The boy's word haunted my waking hours and infiltrated my dreams. It was a pebble in my shoe, a discordant note in the harmony of my daily prayers. Every time my gaze drifted to the Sacred Heart, that hollow space seemed to gape wider, accusing me, demanding answers. It wasn't just a physical absence now, it had become a symbol. A symbol of what? I wasn't entirely sure, but the feeling was potent. St. Jude's, and perhaps my own stewardship, was in some fundamental way broken. I tried to recall any mention of the statue's condition from the time I first arrived. Nothing. It had simply always been this way, an immutable part of the church's fabric. And yet, how could it be? A statue of such artistry, so central to our devotion, surely wouldn't have been acquired in such a state. Logic dictated otherwise. My mind, trained in the rigors of theology and the practicalities of parish administration, wrestled with the profound illogic of the situation, spurred on by the undeniable, inexplicable insight of the boy. There was only one place where such forgotten truths might reside: the church archives, a place I visited perhaps once a year, usually to confirm a baptismal date or locate an old marriage certificate. It was not a place for spiritual revelations, but for dusty paperwork and the echoes of past parish councils. Yet, an insistent nudge, a feeling I could only describe as an act of providence, guided my steps. It was as if the boy's silent presence had opened a hidden door not only in the statue, but in my own perception. The archives of St. Jude Thaddeus were not glamorous. They resided in the cool, damp embrace of the church basement, a subterranean world forgotten by most. The air grew heavier with each step down the creaking wooden stairs, thick with the scent of aged paper, mildew, and the ghost of coal smoke from the old furnace. Cobwebs, like intricate lace spun by unseen hands, draped from the exposed pipes overhead, catching the meager light filtering in from a single grimy window set high near the ceiling. Boxes stacked haphazardly along the walls held the detritus of decades, discarded vestments too frayed to mend, old communion rail cushions, a broken baptismal font lid. It was a graveyard of things past, a testament to the inexorable march of time. I fumbled for the pull chain of the bare bulb that hung precariously from the ceiling, bathing the scene in a harsh yellow glow that did little to dispel the gloom. My breath plumed slightly in the cool air, and a shiver, not entirely from the cold, ran down my spine. To truly understand a parish, one must delve into its history, and here, in this forgotten space, was the accumulated memory of St. Jude's. I made my way to the section dedicated to parish records, a tall, sagging bookshelf groaning under the weight of oversized, leather-bound ledgers. Their spines were cracked, their gilt lettering faded into illegibility. Dust motes danced in the anemic light, a silent ballet in the stagnant air. I pulled out the first one I could reach, its leather cover dry and brittle, threatening to crumble in my hands. The pages within were thick, creamy parchment, adorned with the elegant, looping script of long-dead priests and scribes. My search began with a methodical, almost desperate purpose. I started with the earliest records, tracing the church's foundation, its early benefactors, the challenges of its construction. I moved through volumes marked parish council minutes, building committee reports, donation registers. My fingers grew gritty with dust, my eyes strained, following lines of faded ink, searching for any mention of the Sacred Heart statue, its provenance, its installation, its condition. I wasn't looking for a miracle then. I was looking for an explanation, a mundane truth that would dissolve the boy's unsettling pronouncement. Hours blurred into a quiet, focused eternity. The outside world, the ringing phone in the rectory, the slow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall above, all faded. I was immersed in the quiet hum of history, a silent dialogue with the past. I found entries about new stained glass windows, a leaky roof repaired in 1937, the cost of coal in the winter of '48, but nothing, absolutely nothing, about the Sacred Heart. My hope, which had flared briefly, began to wane, threatened by the sheer volume of indifferent data. Perhaps the boy was simply mistaken, or perhaps the truth was lost to time, unrecorded. Just as a knot of discouragement began to tighten in my chest, I found a slim, unassuming ledger tucked away behind a larger, more imposing volume. Its cover was not leather, but a simple, faded green cloth, and it bore no grand title, only the faint, handwritten label, MISC, Acquisitions and Incidents, 1910-1930. It seemed an unlikely place, but a sudden, inexplicable premonition urged me forward. I opened it carefully, the spine groaning in protest. The entries were less formal, more like personal notes, jotted down in a hurried, looping hand by a Father Michael O'Connell, as the opening page declared. I began to scan the pages, past entries about the purchase of new altar linens and the repair of the rectory's chimney, until my eyes caught a date, August 14th, 1928, and beneath it, a phrase that made my heart lurch. Sacred Heart statue, arrival. I leaned closer, my breath held. The entry was terse but illuminating. Father O'Connell had recorded, with a discernible flourish of pride, the acquisition of the magnificent carving of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, direct from the workshop of Master Giancarlo Bellini in Florence, Italy. Bellini! The name resonated in the annals of sacred art. This was no ordinary carving, but a masterpiece. My eyes eagerly followed the text, searching for details. The heart itself, Father O'Connell had written, is a separate, intricately carved reliquary designed to house a blessed fragment. And then, the words that sent a profound shiver down my spine. Said fragment, presented by the Archbishop upon dedication, is believed to be a sliver of wood from a tree on the Mount of Olives, blessed by His Holiness Pius X, a reliquary, a piece of the Mount of Olives. The boy's simple word, broken, had just cracked open a far deeper, more sacred mystery than I could have ever imagined. This wasn't merely a missing piece of art, it was a missing piece of profound spiritual significance, a tangible link to the Holy Land, to the very footsteps of Christ. I continued reading, my hands trembling slightly as I turned the brittle page. The entries continued, detailing the statue's grand unveiling, the joy of the parish. But then, a sudden, darker shift in tone. An entry dated February 3rd, 1929. Tragedy strikes. Small electrical fire in sacristy. Smoke damage to north wall. Altar linens damaged. And, most grievously, the Sacred Heart reliquary, removed for cleaning prior to the incident, was unfortunately in the sacristy at the time. Presumed destroyed in the inferno. All efforts to locate any fragments have proven fruitless. A sorrowful loss for the entire parish. May God forgive my oversight in its safekeeping. Presumed destroyed. Never found. The words echoed in the quiet basement, carrying the weight of nearly a century of sorrow and loss. It wasn't just lost, it was annihilated, consumed by fire. How, then, could the boy know? How could he, a child born decades after the incident, point so unerringly to the missing heart, calling it broken, implying not merely an absence, but a condition that could be remedied? A profound conviction settled over me, chilling and exhilarating all at once. This boy, this silent, watchful child, was no ordinary child. His presence, his unsettling wisdom, his single, resonant word, it was all a part of something far grander, far beyond the realm of human coincidence. This was an act of providence, a divine orchestration playing out in the quiet corners of my aging parish. God, in his infinite wisdom, had sent a messenger, a tiny, unassuming vessel, to reveal a secret buried deep beneath layers of dust and forgotten history. The loss of that reliquary, presumed destroyed, meant that its recovery would be nothing short of a miracle. The records were clear. It was gone. Yet, the boy's certainty, his unwavering gaze at the empty space, spoke of something else entirely. It spoke of hope where there should have been none, of presence where only absence was recorded. My comfortable, predictable world had not only been shattered, it had been turned inside out. I had always believed in miracles, of course. As a priest, I preached about them, taught about them, but they felt like distant stories, tales from biblical times, or extraordinary occurrences in faraway lands. Never here, in the quiet, fading heart of St. Jude's. Never for me, Father Thomas, with my predictable routines and my quiet anxieties. And yet, here it was. The boy was the catalyst, the spark of divine intervention. His inexplicable knowledge had pulled back the veil on a forgotten tragedy, revealing a wound in the Church's heart that had festered silently for decades. The discovery of the statue's history and the precious nature of its missing heart, now presumed irrevocably lost, deepened the mystery and intensified the need for an impossible solution. A wave of awe, mixed with a healthy dose of trepidation, washed over me. I had been called to witness something extraordinary, something that defied reason and shattered expectation. My faith, once a source of gentle solace, was now being tested, stretched, and redefined by the profound simplicity of a child's single, earth-shattering word. The uncomfortable awakening had indeed begun, and I understood now, with a chilling certainty, that the true journey had only just commenced. The boy, this silent, mysterious messenger, was not merely an instrument. He was a guide, leading me towards a revelation that promised to transform not just a statue, but perhaps the very soul of St. Jude Thaddeus. And in that moment, amongst the forgotten archives, a fragile seed of hope, born from the impossibility of the situation, began to take root in my heart. The brittle pages of St. Jude Thaddeus's past lay scattered across the archival table, each entry a faint whisper from forgotten times, yet none offered solace for the present dilemma. The heart, lost, presumed destroyed, was a testament to the Church's slow decay, a symbol of something vital missing. My discovery, rather than providing closure, had merely deepened the chasm of the unknown, intensifying the quiet ache that had begun with the boy's single, raspy word. The truth, however unsettling, had solidified my conviction. This child was no random wanderer. He was an instrument, a quiet, insistent summons from a place beyond human understanding. My faith, long a comfortable tunic, now felt like a living garment, pulling at the threads of my complacency. I was no longer merely a shepherd. I was being led. Leaving the musty embrace of the archives, I ascended the worn stone steps, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of the years that had passed, the secrets they held. The soft light of the afternoon, filtered through the stained glass windows, cast familiar patterns across the nave, painting the polished pews in hues of amethyst and rose. And there he was, a small, still silhouette in the last pew, precisely where he always was. His presence, once an unsettling intrusion, now felt like a beacon, drawing me with an undeniable gravitational pull. I walked towards him slowly, my steps echoing in the vast silence. Each step felt heavy, charged with the weight of decades of pastoral duty, and the sudden exhilarating lightness of new, terrifying faith. As I approached, the boy, who still had not given us his name, didn't flinch, didn't turn. He simply sat, utterly still, a sentinel of unspoken truth. His gaze was fixed forward, towards the altar, towards the very statue of the Sacred Heart that held our parish's deepest wound. I sat beside him, the scent of old wood and incense clinging to my vestments, a stark contrast to the faint earthy smell that seemed to emanate from him, a scent of wildness and forgotten places. "My son," I began, my voice a quiet rumble in the vastness of the church, I have been to the archives. I have read the old ledgers, the records of this very parish, stretching back over a century. I paused, gathering my thoughts, searching for the right words to convey the magnitude of what I had learned, and the impossibility of what he had asked. They speak of the fire, a small electrical blaze in the 1920s. They speak of the heart of the Sacred Heart statue, how it was lost, presumed destroyed in the chaos. There is no record, not a single one, of it ever being found. I watched him closely, searching for any flicker of understanding, any sign of reaction, but his face remained an unreadable mask. His eyes, though, were different today. They held a depth I hadn't noticed before, a quiet intensity that seemed to transcend his years. They were ancient eyes, full of a knowing that spoke not of textbooks or history, but of something far more profound. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. It was a simple, decisive movement, a silent dismissal of my laborious research, of the collective memory of the parish. My carefully unearthed historical facts, the brittle evidence of loss, were, in his quiet judgment, simply incorrect. It was not destroyed. It was not lost forever. A strange jolt went through me. My mind, trained in logic and evidence, wrestled with the intuitive certainty emanating from this child. How could he know? How could he contradict records that spanned generations? Yet, in that moment, doubt felt like a betrayal. His certainty was a palpable force, a quiet hurricane against the gentle breeze of my own carefully reasoned conclusions. He stood then, without a word, his small, grimy hand emerging from beneath the worn sleeve of his jacket. He didn't look at me, but his gaze, unwavering, was fixed on something beyond my immediate perception. Then he turned and began to walk, not towards the main altar, not towards the familiar sacred spaces, but towards the back of the church, towards the unassuming door that led to the old sacristy. My heart quickened. My rational mind screamed for explanations, for logic, for a reason. But a deeper, more ancient part of me, the part that had sworn a vow to God, simply followed. It was an act of pure faith, an abandonment of my own intellect in deference to something I could not name, but knew to be divine, the old sacristy. It was a place usually reserved for the vestments of long-gone priests, for liturgical items that had fallen out of use, for the quiet preparation before Mass. But what he led me to was not the main room, with its cedar-lined cupboards and polished silver. No, he navigated past the main sacristy, past the dusty old confessionals no longer in use, and deeper into the forgotten nooks and crannies of the church's infrastructure. We stopped beneath the choir loft stairs, in a recessed alcove usually hidden from view by a heavy velvet curtain, now merely pulled aside to reveal a small, cluttered closet. It was a repository of forgotten intentions, a graveyard of the church's utilitarian past. Broken kneelers, their velvet cushions ripped and springs exposed, leaned precariously against each other. Stacks of hymnals, their pages brittle with age, lay scattered on the floor, some gnawed by mice. Discarded flower vases, chipped and dusty, jostled for space with a defunct rusting chalice cleaning kit. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, old paper, and the ghosts of countless forgotten tasks. It was a place of abandonment, of things deemed no longer useful or worthy of care. And yet, the boy stood there, his small form radiating a profound sense of purpose. He lifted his hand again, not trembling this time, but steady, resolute. His finger, still smudged with dirt, pointed directly towards the far wall of the closet, behind an imposing, rotting wooden cabinet that seemed to have been wedged into the space generations ago and never moved since. It was a dark, heavy piece, clearly not meant for this small space, its ornate carvings now obscured by layers of dust and cobwebs. Behind that, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sudden rapid thump of my own heart. The cabinet was enormous, a behemoth that would require more than my strength to move. It stood like a silent guardian, blocking access to whatever the boy believed lay beyond. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on that spot, his certainty an absolute, unwavering beam in the dimness of the closet. There was no doubt, no hesitation in his posture, no hint of childish whim. It was an unyielding, undeniable direction, given with an authority that left no room for question. It was the absolute conviction of one who knew, not suspected, not hoped, but knew. I gazed at the dusty, forgotten cabinet, then at the boy, then back at the cabinet. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the impossibility. Why here? Why hidden? What had happened? The records spoke of fire, of destruction. But he, this silent, ragged child, spoke of a different truth, a hidden truth. His guidance was not a suggestion. It was an imperative, a force of nature I dared not question, for in his small, resolute frame I sensed the very hand of Providence at work. Taking a deep breath, I knew I could not do this alone. I needed assistance, a stronger hand to wrestle with the physical obstacles that stood between us and the boy's silent conviction. "Stay here," I told him, my voice still hushed with awe. "I will be right back." I hurried from the sacristy, my thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and growing excitement. I found Mr. Henderson, our church groundskeeper, mending a loose railing near the parish hall. He was a gruff, practical man, not one prone to flights of fancy or spiritual pronouncements, but he was strong and reliable. "Mr. Henderson," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though an undeniable tremor ran through it, "I need your help with something, rather urgent, in the old sacristy closet." He looked up, a quizzical expression on his weathered face. "The old sacristy, Father? What could be urgent in there? Only rats and dust." "It's about a discovery," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "A potential discovery, something the boy has pointed out." Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow, his gaze drifting towards the empty church where the boy often sat. He knew of the dirty boy, of course, and the strange effect he had on the parish. Curiosity, mixed with a healthy dose of skepticism, flickered in his eyes. But he was a good man, always willing to lend a hand. He slowly put down his tools. "Well, if it's important to you, Father." Together, we returned to the dim closet beneath the choir loft stairs. The boy stood exactly where I had left him, his eyes unwavering on the cabinet. Mr. Henderson surveyed the scene, his brow furrowed. "That old thing? Been there since before my time, Father. Probably full of termites." "Perhaps," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But we need to move it. The boy believes there is something behind it." Mr. Henderson grunted, but without further protest, he set to work. The cabinet was indeed heavy, resistant to our initial attempts. We pushed and strained, the wood groaning in protest, sending clouds of ancient dust into the air, making us cough. Finally, with a combined effort, we managed to wrench it free from its decades-long resting place, dragging it forward, away from the wall, revealing the stone surface behind it. The moment the cabinet was clear, the boy stepped forward, no longer a silent guide, but an active participant. He pointed again, his finger now tracing the outline of a distinct crack in the stone, a line that seemed to betray the presence of a loose panel, a section of the wall that did not quite belong. My breath caught in my throat. It was not a uniform wall, but a carefully placed stone, almost perfectly disguised against its brethren. It was a secret, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to find it. My fingers trembled as I reached out, tracing the outline he indicated, feeling for the faint unevenness, the subtle give, and there it was, a stone, unlike the others, that shifted slightly under my touch. My fingers, still trembling from the revelation of the hidden crack, traced the outline of the stone. It felt cooler than its neighbors, its edges less perfectly aligned, a subtle betrayal of its purpose. With a deep breath that stirred the dust motes dancing in the dim light filtering into the storage closet, I pressed against it. It resisted at first, a stubborn secret clinging to its long slumber. I pressed again, harder this time, a prayer forming silently on my lips. "Lord, if this is your will." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stone gave way. A faint grinding sound, like a sigh from the ancient wall, accompanied its movement. I worked my fingers into the newly formed crevice, using them as leverage, and with a final straining pull, the stone popped free, tumbling into my waiting hands. It was heavier than I expected, thick with the accumulated grime of decades. I set it gently aside, my gaze already fixed on the dark opening it revealed. Behind the stone was not a vast chamber, but a small, unassuming cavity, perhaps a foot deep and no wider than my spread hand. It was a space hollowed out of the solid wall, a deliberate hiding place. The air that wafted from it was cool, stale, and smelled faintly of old earth and dry stone, a scent of forgotten time. It was utterly dark within, a void that held both promise and the chilling possibility of emptiness. My heart pounded a rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation. The boy, who had stood silently watching, now stepped closer, his small frame radiating a quiet certainty that shamed my own lingering doubt. His presence was a silent affirmation, a nudge from Providence itself. I hesitated for only a moment. Then, steeling my resolve, I reached into the cool, dark cavity. My fingertips, tentative at first, brushed against something soft and yielding. Not cold stone, not splintered wood, but a fabric, rough and resilient. Oilcloth. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound recognition, ran through me. This was it. This had to be it. My fingers curled around the object, feeling its contours. It was a bundle, wrapped tightly, its shape distinct, a gentle curve, a specific heft. My breath caught in my throat. It felt significant, like holding a piece of history, a forgotten whisper from the past, now made tangible. Withdrawing my hand carefully, slowly, as if pulling a delicate bird from its nest, I brought the wrapped bundle into the meager light of the closet. It was about the size of a man's fist, wrapped in layers of thick, dark oilcloth, tied with twine that looked as ancient as the stone itself. My hands, usually steady and practiced, now trembled with an almost uncontrollable energy. This was not just an artifact. It was a response to a silent prayer, a tangible answer to a riddle spoken by a silent boy. I knelt there on the dusty floor, the boy watching me with an intensity that seemed to penetrate my very soul. My fingers fumbled with the brittle twine. It had hardened with age, resisting my efforts. With a whispered plea for patience, I managed to untie one knot, then another, until the last strand gave way. The oilcloth, stiff and rustling, began to unfold. Each layer revealed more of the bundle, more of the deep brown fabric that had preserved its contents for so long. The faint smell of beeswax and thyme emanated from it as I unwrapped it, layer by painstaking layer. And then, there it was. No explosion of light, no choir of angels, just the quiet, profound unveiling of a small, exquisitely carved wooden heart. It was dark with age, a deep, rich mahogany hue, but miraculously untouched by the ravages of time, of fire, or decay. Every curve was perfect, every edge smooth, testifying to the skill of the artisan who had created it. It was not a simple, stylized heart, but one rendered with anatomical accuracy, yet imbued with an ethereal grace. It was both of this earth and entirely of the spirit. In its very center, precisely as the old archives had hinted, was a tiny, glass-covered locket, and within that locket, a minuscule splinter of wood, no larger than a grain of rice, nestled in its velvet bed. A sliver of wood from the Mount of Olives, a physical fragment of the sacred, hidden away, lost, and now found again. I held it in my palm, my gaze fixed on the small sacred fragment. It was then that I felt it. Not just the physical weight of the wood, the coldness of the glass, or the history emanating from the relic. It was a warmth, a profound, inexplicable warmth that began in my fingers, spread through my hands, and coursed up my arms, through my chest, and into my very soul. It was not the warmth of fire, but something far deeper, far more ancient. It felt like recognition, like coming home. It felt like grace. It was a sensation that transcended the physical, a comfort that spoke directly to the spiritual yearning deep within me. It felt as if a missing piece of my own heart had been returned, filling a void I hadn't even realized existed. It was the warmth of God's presence, unmistakable and overwhelming. A wave of certainty washed over me, silencing every doubt. every question that had ever plagued my faith. This was no coincidence. This was no chance discovery. This was an act of divine love, orchestrated with an intricate beauty that humbled me to my core. I looked up, my eyes still a little blurry with the unexpected emotion, to meet the gaze of the boy. He was still there, utterly silent, but his face was transformed. A faint, knowing smile graced his lips. It was a smile I had never seen before, a gentle curve that erased the grime and the worry from his young face, illuminating it with an almost ethereal glow. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction, of peace fulfilled. It was the smile of someone who had completed his sacred task, a messenger, finally able to rest. In that moment, he was no longer just the dirty boy or the invader, but Daniel, a vessel of God's mysterious purpose, a child of providence. His smile was the final confirmation, the punctuation mark on a sentence whispered by heaven itself. And in that smile, I saw a secret revealed, a promise kept, and a future reborn. The quiet certainty of Daniel's smile, that silent affirmation, was a balm to my soul, a sacred seal on the journey we had undertaken. It felt, in that moment, as though the very air of the sacristy had shifted, made thinner, clearer, charged with an invisible electricity. I knew then, with a conviction that resonated deep within my marrow, that this was not merely an old relic found. It was a divine summons, a clear call to reveal the hand of God at work within our humble parish. The following Sunday, I stood before my congregation, holding the ancient wooden heart gently in my hands. The sight of it, cradled against my worn black cassock, seemed to hush the usual rustle of the faithful. I recounted the story, beginning with Daniel's arrival, his persistent silence, his single, resonant word, broken, and the revelation of the missing heart. I spoke of my descent into the archives, the faded ledgers, and the legend of the reliquary. Finally, I described Daniel's unerring guidance to the hidden cavity and the miraculous preservation of the heart itself. There were murmurs, of course, a few polite coughs of skepticism, but beneath it, I could sense a stirring, a quiet spark of hope in eyes that had long grown accustomed to the predictable. "We will hold a special Mass," I announced, my voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment, "to restore the Sacred Heart to its rightful place. Come, my dear parishioners, and let us bear witness to the Lord's enduring grace." And come they did. The Church of St. Jude Thaddeus, often a cavern of echoing silence, was transformed. The pews, usually sparse and scattered, were packed shoulder to shoulder. Young families I hadn't seen in years occupied the front rows, their children wide-eyed and hushed. Mrs. Gable sat beside Maria Sanchez, their usual anxieties replaced by a shared, palpable anticipation. The air hummed with a different kind of reverence, a mixture of hopeful curiosity and fervent prayer. Daniel, now clean and dressed in borrowed clothes, sat with the Sanchez family, his intense gaze fixed on the statue, a silent sentinel awaiting the culmination of his mission. After the consecration, as the Holy Spirit descended upon the altar, I signaled to Thomas, our stout groundskeeper, who carefully positioned a small stepladder beneath the alcove where the Sacred Heart of Jesus statue stood. My own heart pounded a rhythm against my ribs as I ascended, each step deliberate, slow. The wooden heart felt warm in my palm, smooth beneath my thumb, carrying the immense weight of decades, of prayers, of forgotten faith. I stood eye-level with the hollow space in the statue's chest, the opening that had been a silent void for so long. The silence in the church was absolute, broken only by the gentle creak of the old wood and the collective intake of breath from the hundreds of souls gathered below. With trembling hands, I guided the wooden heart towards its intended resting place. It fit perfectly, a gentle click as it nestled into the cavity, as if it had simply returned home after a long journey. The moment it settled, a brilliant, golden light erupted from within the statue. It wasn't a glare, but a soft, enveloping radiance that pulsed outward, bathing the entire sanctuary in a celestial glow. The stained glass windows, usually vibrant only with morning light, now seemed to contain the very essence of the sun. radiating liquid gold into every corner. It was blindingly beautiful, utterly inexplicable, and profoundly real. A collective gasp, a single, unified exhalation of pure awe and wonder filled the sanctuary. No one screamed, no one shouted, only that deep, guttural sound of human hearts overwhelmed by the miraculous. Tears streamed down faces, hands instinctively clasped over mouths, and some, including myself, simply wept, overcome by the sheer, unadulterated presence of the divine. The light grew, pouring out through the ancient doors and streaming from the arched windows, spilling into the bright afternoon like liquid gold. And then, as if the light were the very breath of God, the world outside responded. Through the resplendent glow pouring from the windows, I saw it. The old dogwood tree on the church lawn, a skeletal sentinel that had stood barren for a decade, its branches brittle and lifeless, instantly burst forth. A cascade of pure white blossoms, luminous and perfect, unfurled from every twig, every limb, transforming the dead wood into a vibrant, living fountain of pristine beauty. It was a silent explosion of grace, a natural miracle mirroring the spiritual one within, witnessed by every soul whose gaze followed the outpouring light. In that moment, faith was not merely believed, it was seen, felt, tasted, a tangible truth blossoming before our very eyes. The silence that followed the blooming of the dogwood was not empty, but full, filled with the collective gasp of a congregation that had witnessed the impossible, with the sudden, reverent hush of a world touched by the divine. The golden light that had erupted from the Sacred Heart statue did not vanish. Rather, it began a slow, graceful transformation. It softened, receding from its initial blinding brilliance, and settled into a gentle, constant pulse within the chest of the carved figure. It was as if the very heart of Christ, once lost and now found, beat with an eternal rhythm, a warm, golden glow that infused the air with a palpable sense of peace and holy wonder. It became the living center of our sanctuary, a silent hymn of God's enduring presence. Indeed, the miracle at St. Jude's changed everything. The hushed whispers about the invader transformed into grateful murmurings about the boy who brought us back to life. We learned his name was Daniel, a beautiful, strong name, when Mrs. Sanchez, with tears of joyful compassion in her eyes, introduced him to me one morning, no longer silent, no longer veiled by grime, but with a clear, soft voice. He spoke of a grandmother, long gone, who had whispered tales of the hidden heart of St. Jude's, a secret passed down through generations of a family who believed in forgotten things. His past, once a haunting shadow, was now a story of resilience, and with the loving embrace of the Sanchez family, who took him in as their own, that shadow was utterly banished by the light he had helped rekindle. Our pews, once echoing with the emptiness of fading faith, now swelled with the faithful, the curious, and the hopeful. They came from our parish, from neighboring towns, and soon from distant cities, drawn by the whispers of the light that pulsed within the statue and the sight of the old dogwood tree, which continued to bloom in an impossible pristine white, regardless of season or weather. It stood as a verdant testament on our church lawn, a living symbol of resurrection. Our coffers, once barely sufficient for the peeling paint and creaking roof, now overflowed, not for our own needs, but for the poor, for the hungry, for those who had felt as lost and broken as the missing heart itself. Our faith, once a quiet, comfortable habit, was now a vibrant, roaring fire, fueled by the undeniable proof of God's active grace in our midst. People lingered after Mass, not just for coffee, but to share stories, to pray before the glowing heart, to touch the blossoms of the miraculous tree. Confession lines grew, filled with souls eager to unburden themselves and step into the light. The spirit of St. Jude Thaddeus, the patron saint of lost causes, had truly descended upon us, transforming what was once fading into something gloriously new. I am just an old priest, you see, a man whose 40 years in this quiet parish had settled into a gentle rhythm, perhaps too gentle, too predictable. But I was granted the grace, a profound and undeserved grace, to witness that God does not send his miracles to the perfect, to those who believe they have all the answers. No, he sends them to the broken, to a forgotten statue, to a silent, grimy boy, to an old, barren tree, and to a community whose faith had grown tired, so that in the miraculous act of healing them, of restoring what was lost, he might heal us all, body and spirit, and remind us that his love, like the light within the Sacred Heart, beats forever, calling us home.